Imagine a house that is slowly eating itself alive while the women inside dance among the ruins. It sits at the edge of the Atlantic, wrapped in sea fog and secrets, a place where the American dream didn't just die, it rotted, sweetly and slowly, like overripe fruit. This isn't just a story about a crumbling mansion. It is a story about the terrifying, beautiful, and suffocating bond between a mother and daughter who decided that if the world wouldn't accept them, they would simply create a world of their own. This is the legend of Grey Gardens. Part 1. The Eden at the Edge of the World. To understand the tragedy, you first have to be blinded by the beauty. We have to go back to the beginning, to the roaring 20s in East Hampton, long before the cats and the raccoons claimed the halls. Picture the Atlantic Ocean as it was then, a vast, churning sheet of slate gray, crashing against the dunes with a rhythmic, hypnotic violence. If you moved inland through the pristine white mist, you would hit a wall. Not just any wall, but concrete imported all the way from Spain, rising from the sand like a fortress. Inside those walls lay Eden. This was the inception of Grey Gardens. It was a masterpiece of shingle-style architecture, a house that seemed to breathe in the salt air. The gardens were a watercolor painting come to life, orchestrated by the famous landscape architect Ruth Dean. It was a deliberate, curated world of soft purples, pale pinks, and climbing roses, all designed to harmonize with the silver sea fog. If you listened closely in those days, you wouldn't hear the scratching of animals in the attic. You would hear a piano, you would hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the sound of laughter drifting from open French doors, and at the center of it all was Edith Bouvier Beale, known to everyone as Big Edie. She was young, radiant, a creature of high society with a voice that seemed destined for the opera stage, not just a living room. She moved through that house like a queen, surrounded by the adoration of the American elite, and always in her shadow was her daughter, Little Edie, a girl with wide eyes, absorbing the glamour, already dreaming of a stage much larger than the one her mother commanded. This was the peak. The sun was shining on the Beale family, but if you looked out toward the horizon, you could see the fog rolling in, and once it arrived, it would never truly leave. Part 2. The Slow Erosion. The shift didn't happen overnight. Catastrophes rarely do. They creep in through the cracks. The year was 1946, and the sunlight in East Hampton seemed to grow harsher, the house a little colder. It started with a telegram. It was short, brutal, and completely devoid of emotion. Phelan Beale, the patriarch, the man who paid for the crystal and the roses, ended the marriage from Mexico. In the high society circles of the time, this wasn't just a breakup. It was a social guillotine. The shock on Big Edie's face wasn't merely heartbreak. It was the terrifying realization of vulnerability. The settlement he left her was a pittance, a mere $300 a month. In the real world, that was difficult. In the wealthy enclave of East Hampton, it was destitution. But Big Edie had something money couldn't buy. She had pride. She had the house, and she had the land. She decided, with a stubbornness that would define the rest of her life, that she wasn't going anywhere. As the decades bled from the 1950s into the 1960s, a strange phenomenon occurred. Time, which moves linearly for the rest of us, seemed to stop inside the walls of Grey Gardens. Outside, the world was accelerating. The atomic age dawned. The civil rights movement marched forward. The sexual revolution changed the cultural landscape. But inside the mansion, the clock was frozen. We have to talk about Little Edie during these lost years. There was a moment, a fleeting, shimmering moment, where she almost escaped. We see flashes of her in Manhattan, breathtakingly beautiful, modeling, dancing, standing on the verge of the stardom she so desperately craved. But there was an invisible tether, a cord made of guilt and duty that stretched from East Hampton to New York City. When her mother fell ill, that tether snapped tight. The unbreakable bond pulled her back. She returned to Grey Gardens for what she thought was a weekend to care for her mother. She ended up staying for a lifetime. With Little Edie trapped and Big Edie aging, the house began to rebel. The garden, once manicured and polite, turned into a wild, briar-filled jungle. The vines, which had been decorative, turned invasive. They crawled up the shingles like veins, prying their way into the window frames, shattering the glass. Then came the intruders. First, it was just the wind through a broken pane. Then, a stray cat found shelter. Then another. Then a family of raccoons took up residence in the attic. The distinction between indoors and outdoors began to blur. The psychological landscape shifted along with the physical one. Mother and daughter stopped throwing parties for the elite and started performing only for each other. The house became a cocoon, a dusty, velvet-lined bunker where the dust settled on the furniture and was simply never wiped away. Part 3. The Gothic Horror. By 1971, the eccentric decline had turned into a Gothic horror story. The scene that unfolded that year was chaotic. Sirens cut through the quiet, moneyed air of East Hampton. Men in suits, inspectors from the Suffolk County Health Department, forced their way through the overgrown privet hedges that had hidden the house from view for years. What they found inside was a nightmare. If we could walk through the house with them, the first thing that would hit us is the smell. It was thick, a suffocating mixture of sea salt, cat urine, and decades of old perfume. The visuals were even more jarring. Cans of liver pâté were stacked like towers in the hallways. Empty boxes carpeted the floors. In the once grand dining room, the oil portraits of their ancestors looked down upon a table covered in debris and cat waste. And there, in the middle of it all, was Big Edie. Now in her 70s, she held court in her bed, surrounded by trash, completely unfazed. She treated the health inspectors not as threats, but as rude guests who hadn't bothered to RSVP. Little Edie, now in her 50s, darted around her, frantic, trying to explain the artistic nature of their existence, trying to frame the squalor as a lifestyle choice. The media storm that followed was explosive. The headline screamed, "Jackie's aunt living in squalor." The juxtaposition was too delicious for the press to ignore. On one page of the newspaper, you had Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the former First Lady, the most glamorous woman in the world, iconic in her oversized sunglasses. On the facing page, her own flesh and blood, her aunt and her first cousin, were living in a house filled with raccoons and fleas. It was a moment of high drama when the rescue finally arrived. A pristine limousine navigated the overgrown, treacherous driveway. Jackie Kennedy and her sister, Lee Radziwill, stepped out. To their credit, they didn't step out with judgment. They stepped out with grim determination. Jackie didn't see monsters in that house. She saw family in trouble. She wrote the checks. She funded the cleanup. The garbage was hauled out by the ton. The plumbing was fixed. The structure was saved. But here is the crucial thing. While the house was cleaned superficially, the soul of the house, the chaos, the madness, the codependency, remained completely untouched. Part 4. The Capture. It was into this strange, post-cleanup world that Albert and David Maysles arrived in 1973. They were filmmakers with cameras on their shoulders, looking for a story. They found a legend. This moment marks the pivotal turning point of the narrative. Up until now, the Beales were victims of circumstance, but when the cameras started rolling, they transformed. They became stars. For the first time in decades, they had an audience. The crumbling house transformed back into a stage. This is where we see the birth of the icon that is Little Edie. We watch her standing before a cracked mirror in a room where the wallpaper is peeling off in long, melancholy strips. She picks up a brown sweater. She doesn't put it on. She wraps it around her head, pinning it with a diamond brooch. She steps into a pair of fishnets and pulls a tablecloth around her waist to form a skirt. She turns to the camera, her eyes blazing with an intensity that is half madness, half genius. "This is the best costume for the day," she declares. It wasn't just fashion, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated creativity born of desperation. She was a fashion revolutionary living in a prison of her own making, creating armor out of rags. The filmmakers also captured the mother-daughter dance, a dynamic that was dissected frame by frame. They bickered constantly. Big Edie would sing Tea for Two in a warbling and ghostly soprano, demanding applause from a room empty of everyone but cats and camera crew. Little Edie would rant about the Republican politics of East Hampton and blame her mother for driving away every suitor she ever had. They hurt each other with the surgical precision of people who know every single weak spot the other possesses. Yet in the next breath, they would eat pâté from the same spoon. They slept in the same room. They were two halves of the same soul. The camera captured the tragedy perfectly. Little Edie's lost potential warring against Big Edie's possessive, consuming love. There is a key visual from this time that haunts everyone who sees it. Little Edie dancing on the porch with a small American flag, marching to a military tune that only she can hear. Behind her, the house is rotting, but she stands tall, and the captain of a sinking ship saluting the horizon. When the film, titled simply Grey Gardens, was released in 1975, the world was shocked. Some were horrified, some were judgmental, but ultimately, everyone was mesmerized. The Beales thought they had finally made it. They didn't fully realize that some people were laughing at them. They only heard the applause. They had achieved immortality, but the cost was their privacy. Part 5. The Silence and the Shipwreck. But cameras eventually stop rolling. The crew leaves, and silence returns. In the winter of 1977, the music finally died. Big Edie passed away. The sequence of events that followed is stark and lonely. For the first time in her entire life, Little Edie was alone in the mansion. The silence must have been deafening. The cats still roamed. The raccoons still scratched in the attic, but the anchor was gone. Little Edie wandered the halls, touching the piano where her mother played, looking at the portraits of Big Edie as a young woman. The codependency was broken, but it didn't leave her free. It left her with a void. She was 60 years old and she was an orphan. She faced a decision. She put the house on the market. Developers circled the property like sharks sensing blood in the water. They saw the land, 4 acres of oceanfront gold. They looked at the house and saw garbage, something to be bulldozed and forgotten. But Little Edie stood staunch. She refused to sell to anyone who would tear it down. The house was her mother. To destroy the house would be to kill Big Edie a second time. Enter the unlikely saviors, Ben Bradley, the executive editor of the Washington Post, and his wife, the journalist Sally Quinn. They were the antithesis of the Beales, sharp, modern, grounded in the reality of Washington, D.C. But Sally Quinn saw the magic. She walked through the ruins and saw the bones of the masterpiece underneath. When Ben and Sally took possession of the house in 1979, the discovery process was less like a real estate transaction and more like an archaeological excavation. They described it as a shipwreck. They opened the door to the attic and found the skeleton of a raccoon. They found boxes of letters from the 1920s, silk dresses that disintegrated into dust when touched, and a grand piano collapsed on 3 legs. The smell was overwhelming. It was a tomb of memories. Then came the departure. It is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the story. Sally Quinn gave Little Edie a choice. She could clean out the house or she could leave it broom clean. Little Edie chose to leave it all. She walked out the front door with just a few suitcases. She left behind the furniture, the photos, the rotting mattresses, the history, the pain. She walked out of the frame, got into a car, and drove away toward a new life in Florida. She never looked back. The restoration that followed was a visual symphony of rebirth. Trucks hauled away tons of debris. The floors were stripped, revealing honey-colored wood that had been hidden beneath decades of filth. The vines were cut back, revealing the architecture. Fresh white paint covered the grime. The garden was replanted and the colors returned. The blues, the purples, the pinks. The house breathed again. It transformed from a haunted house back into the Grand Dame of 1897. Epilogue. The ghosts remain today. Grey Gardens stands pristine. It is decorated with taste and elegance. If you visited now, you might see a dinner party ending, hear guests laughing, see the light glowing warmly from the windows. But if the camera were to linger, If it were to drift away from the party and move up the stairs, you might hear the floorboards creak. It is the same creak from 1970. If you moved into the bedroom that was once Little Edie's, where the window is open and the curtains blow in the ocean breeze, you might feel a shift in the air. Little Edie once said, "It's very difficult to keep the line between the past and the present. You know what I mean? I think the past is far more real." Little Edie spent her final years in Bal Harbour, Florida, walking along the beach in bathing suits of her own design, smiling, finally free. She passed away in 2002. The house was sold again in 2017 for over $15 million. The raccoons have never returned, but the legend remains. Grey Gardens teaches us that houses are not just structures, they are witnesses. And while the paint is fresh and the floors are clean, if you listen closely to the wind coming off the Atlantic, you can still hear the faint warbling sound of a song and the defiant stomp of a woman dancing with a flag, refusing to let the world tell her who she is. The American dream may have rotted here, but something else grew in its place, a strange, enduring, and beautiful wildness that can never be tamed.